The rain hammered against the windshield of the black Bentley Continental as it crawled through the winding mountain roads of Cedar Falls, Colorado. Marcus Chen gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white against the leather, as another flash of lightning illuminated the treacherous curves ahead. The GPS had lost signal 20 miles back, leaving him stranded in a maze of unfamiliar backroads, with nothing but static from the radio and the relentless storm for company. Marcus had built his fortune on precision, on controlling every variable, in his tech empire that spanned 3 continents. But here, in this godforsaken stretch of nowhere, all his billions couldn't command the weather or conjure cell towers from thin air. The irony wasn't lost on him that the man who had revolutionized global communications was now completely cut off from the world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. A sudden grinding noise from beneath the hood made his stomach drop. The engine coughed once, twice, then died completely. The Bentley rolled to a stop on the shoulder of the empty highway, its headlights cutting through sheets of rain that seemed to mock his predicament. Marcus sat in the sudden silence, listening to the storm rage around his luxury tomb, and felt more alone than he had since the day his mother died 6 months ago. Dr. Chen had been the only person who ever saw past his wealth, past the cold businessman facade he'd perfected over the years. She had been a brilliant neurologist, dedicating her life to researching rare genetic conditions that most doctors dismissed as untreatable. Her own battle with Huntington's disease had begun when Marcus was just starting his company. Her tremors, barely noticeable at first, but gradually stealing away her coordination, her speech, and eventually her recognition of the son who loved her more than anything in the world. The funeral had been a spectacle, hundreds of colleagues and acquaintances paying their respects to the tech mogul's mother. But Marcus remembered feeling utterly hollow as he stood beside her casket, knowing that the one person who truly understood him was gone forever. The genetic counselor's words still echoed in his mind from that terrible meeting 3 months ago. "There's a 50% chance you carry the gene, Mr. Chen. We should discuss testing options." He had walked out without another word, unable to face the possibility that he might be destined for the same cruel fate. Now, stranded in this storm, Marcus couldn't help but wonder if this was some kind of cosmic punishment for running away from the truth. He pulled out his phone, hoping against hope for even a single bar of service, but the screen showed nothing but emergency calls only. The nearest town, according to his last GPS reading, was Cedar Falls, population 2,847, still 15 miles ahead. Through this mountain pass, Marcus gathered his expensive overcoat and stepped out into the deluge. The rain immediately soaked through his Italian leather shoes, and he realized with bitter irony that his $1,000 suit offered about as much protection as tissue paper against the Colorado storm. He popped the hood, though he knew next to nothing about engines beyond the fact that they were supposed to make cars move. The sophisticated machinery beneath gleamed uselessly in the lightning flashes, as mysterious to him as ancient hieroglyphics. He was about to retreat back to the car when headlights appeared through the rain, approaching slowly from the direction he'd been heading. Marcus waved his arms, feeling foolish but desperate as a battered pickup truck pulled over behind his stranded Bentley. The truck's engine rattled like a coffee can full of bolts, but it was running, which made it infinitely more valuable than his luxury vehicle at the moment. 2 figures emerged from the truck, moving with careful synchronization through the storm. As they approached, Marcus could see they were young, maybe 16 or 17, with identical features that marked them as twins. Both had dark hair plastered to their heads by the rain and wore simple work clothes that were already soaked through. What struck Marcus most was their eyes, an unusual shade of green that seemed to hold depths far beyond their years. "Car," Trouble? The first twin asked, having to shout over the storm. His voice carried a slight tremor that made Marcus think of his mother in her final months, though this boy's shake seemed different somehow, more controlled. "Engine died completely," Marcus replied, water streaming down his face. "I don't suppose either of you knows about cars?" The second twin stepped forward, and Marcus noticed his hands had the same subtle tremor as his brother's. "We know enough," he said with a slight smile. "I'm Jake Morrison, and this is my brother Sam. We run the auto shop in Cedar Falls with our dad." Marcus felt a surge of relief. "Marcus Chen, I can't tell you how grateful I am that you stopped." Jake was already examining the engine with practiced efficiency, while Sam retrieved a flashlight from their truck. "Alternator's shot," Jake called out after a few minutes. "She's not going anywhere tonight, especially not in this storm." "Is there a hotel in Cedar Falls?" Marcus asked, already dreading the answer based on the town's tiny population. Sam laughed, but not unkindly. "Motel closed down 2 years ago, but our dad runs a bed and breakfast above the shop. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry." Marcus considered his options, which were essentially non-existent. He could call for a helicopter rescue once the storm passed, but that would take hours, and the twins had already shown him more kindness than he'd experienced in months. "That would be incredible, thank you." As they drove through the storm towards Cedar Falls, Marcus found himself wedged between the two brothers in the cramped cab of their pickup. The heat was broken, but neither Jake nor Sam complained about the cold, instead maintaining an easy conversation about the storm, the town, and their father's business. Marcus noticed that both brothers occasionally paused mid-sentence, their hands gripping the seats as subtle tremors passed through them. But they seemed completely unaware of it, continuing their thoughts as if nothing had happened. "You boys been working on cars long?" Marcus asked, partly to fill the silence and partly because their competence had impressed him despite their youth. "Since we could hold a wrench," Sam replied with a grin. "Dad's been teaching us everything he knows, says we've got natural instincts for it even if our hands aren't always steady." Jake nodded, flexing his fingers unconsciously. "Some days are better than others. The cold makes it worse, but we manage." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the broken heater. The tremors, the way they spoke about good days and bad days, the careful way they moved their hands. He'd seen it all before in his mother's careful gestures during the early stages of her illness. But Huntington's disease was supposed to be rare, affecting maybe 4 in every 100,000 people. What were the odds of encountering 2 teenagers who might be showing early symptoms? Cedar Falls appeared through the rain like something from a Norman Rockwell painting, if Norman Rockwell had painted during an apocalyptic storm. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Main Street was lined with old-fashioned storefronts, their windows glowing warmly against the darkness. Morrison's Auto Repair sat at the far end of the street, a modest 2-story building with living quarters above the garage bays. A hand-painted sign swayed violently in the wind, but Marcus could make out Morrison and Sons in faded blue letters. Sam pulled the truck into the garage through a side entrance, and the sudden silence as the engine died felt almost shocking after hours of wind and rain. The garage was cluttered but organized, tools hanging in precise rows and parts stacked. With military efficiency, it smelled of motor oil and honest work, a sharp contrast to the sterile chrome and glass of Marcus's corporate offices. "Dad should be upstairs," Jake said, leading the way to a narrow staircase at the back of the garage. "Fair warning, he's probably going to want to feed you. He thinks anyone who gets caught in a storm must be half-starved." The apartment above the garage was small but comfortable, filled with well-worn furniture and family photographs that spoke of a life lived fully despite modest means. A man in his 50s emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. Richard Morrison had the same green eyes as his sons, but his face was weathered by years of outdoor work and worry. Lines that spoke of challenges faced and overcome. "Found him stranded about 15 miles out," Sam explained as they made introductions. "Alternators completely gone." Richard shook Marcus's hand with a firm grip, studying him with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read people. "Quickly, Richard Morrison, welcome to Cedar Falls, such as it is. You're lucky my boys were out tonight. Most folks have better sense than to drive in weather like this." Marcus found himself relaxing despite the circumstances. There was something about Richard's straightforward manner that reminded him of his mother's no-nonsense approach to life. "I was trying to make it to Denver for a business meeting, but the GPS led me astray." "Technology," Richard said with a knowing smile. "Wonderful until it isn't. Come on, let's get you some coffee and dry clothes. You look like you went for a swim in your business suit." As Richard bustled around preparing coffee and sandwiches, Marcus watched the family dynamics with growing fascination. Jake and Sam moved around each other with the unconscious coordination of twins, but there was something more. When one brother's hand trembled while reaching for a cup, the other would smoothly take over the task without any apparent communication. It was so seamless that Marcus wondered if he was the only one who noticed. "The boys tell me you need a place for the night," Richard said, setting a steaming mug in front of Marcus. "We don't usually take guests, but the storm's got everyone hunkered down. You're welcome to stay in the spare room." Marcus wrapped his hands around the warm mug, grateful for both the heat and the kindness. "I appreciate it more than you know. I can pay whatever you think is fair." Richard waved away the offer. "We'll worry about that tomorrow. Tonight, you're just someone who needs help." As the evening wore on, Marcus found himself drawn into easy conversation with the Morrison family. Richard had started the auto shop 20 years ago, after leaving a corporate job in Denver, seeking a simpler life where he could raise his sons away from the pressures of city living. The twins were seniors in high school, both planning to take over the family business rather than pursue college, though Marcus could tell from their intelligent questions and quick grasp of complex mechanical concepts that they were more than capable of academic success. "What made you decide to stay in Cedar Falls?" Marcus asked Jake during a lull in the conversation. Jake and Sam exchanged a glance, one of those silent communications that twins seem to master. "This is home," Jake said simply. "Besides, someone needs to keep the shop running and we're good at it." "Even with—" Marcus hesitated, unsure how to phrase his observation delicately. "The shaking," Sam finished with a matter-of-fact tone. "Yeah, we've got some challenges, but we work around them. Dad taught us that there's always a way to solve a problem if you're willing to think creatively." Richard's expression grew more serious. "The boys were diagnosed with juvenile Huntington's disease when they were 14, he said quietly. "Genetic condition they inherited from their mother. She passed when they were 12. Marcus felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. The coffee mug trembled in his hands, and for a moment he wasn't sure if it was from shock or if he was experiencing his own symptoms. "Huntington's disease," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know something about it?" Richard asked, noting Marcus's reaction. Marcus set down his coffee with extreme care, his mind racing. "My mother died from Huntington's 6 months ago. I watched her battle it for 7 years. The room fell, completely silent, except for the continued drumming of rain against the windows. Jake and Sam stared at Marcus with new interest, while Richard leaned back in his chair, processing this unexpected connection. "I'm sorry for your loss," Richard said eventually. "It's a cruel disease." "Have you been tested?" Sam asked with the directness that seemed to run in the family. Marcus found himself being completely honest for the first time in months. "I'm too scared. The genetic counselor said I have a 50% chance of carrying the gene. I've been running from that knowledge ever since." Jake leaned forward, his tremor momentarily stilled by the intensity of his focus. "Running doesn't change what's in your DNA," he said gently. "Trust me, we tried that approach at first." "How do you do it?" Marcus asked, looking between the twins. "How do you live knowing what's coming?" "One day at a time," Sam replied. "Some days the symptoms are barely noticeable. Other days we have to adapt our techniques, use different tools, ask for help. But we still fix cars, we still have plans, we still live our lives." Richard watched his sons with obvious pride. "They've taught me more about courage than I ever taught them about auto repair." Marcus spent the night in the Morrison's spare room, lying awake and listening to the storm gradually subside outside. For the first time since his mother's diagnosis, he'd met people who understood not just the medical reality of Huntington's disease, but the emotional weight of living with that knowledge. Jake and Sam faced an uncertain future with a grace and determination that made his own fear seem not cowardly, but simply human. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the storm having washed the mountain air clean. Marcus woke to the smell of bacon and coffee drifting up from the kitchen below. When he joined the family for breakfast, he found Jake and Sam already dressed in work clothes, preparing to tackle the repair of his Bentley. "Sleep well?" Richard asked, setting a plate of eggs and toast in front of Marcus. "Better than I have in months," Marcus admitted, surprised to realize it was true. "There's something peaceful about this place." "That's what drew us here originally," Richard said. "After my wife Sarah died, the boys and I needed somewhere we could heal. Together, Cedar Falls gave us that." Through the kitchen window, Marcus could see the mountains rising majestically around the small town, their peaks still dusted with snow from the previous night's storm. It was a far cry from the glass towers and urban chaos of his normal life. But there was something appealing about the simplicity, the sense of community that seemed to permeate everything here. "About the alternator," Jake said, consulting a notebook covered in careful mechanical diagrams. "We'll have to order the part from Denver. Should be here by tomorrow afternoon if we call it in this morning." Marcus pulled out his phone, relieved to see he finally had service again. His assistant had left 17 voicemails, and his calendar showed 3 missed meetings that would probably cost his company millions in delayed deals. 6 months ago, such professional disasters would have sent him into a panic. Now, sitting in this simple kitchen with people who faced genuine life and death challenges with such equanimity, corporate emergencies seemed almost trivial. "Take your time with the repair," he heard himself saying. "I think I'd like to stay in Cedar Falls for a few days, if that's all right with you." Richard raised an eyebrow. Most folks can't wait to get back to their important lives in the city. Marcus considered this, watching Jake carefully measure coffee grounds with hands that trembled slightly but maintained perfect precision. "Maybe I'm discovering that those lives aren't as important as I thought they were." Sam looked up from his notebook with a grin. "Fair warning, if you stay long enough, this place has a way of getting into your blood. Dad came here for a weekend 20 years ago and never left." "What brought him here originally?" Marcus asked. "Work conference in Denver," Richard said with a chuckle. "Got lost in the mountains just like you did. Ended up spending the night with a local family who showed me what real hospitality looked like. Sometimes getting lost is the best way to find what you're really looking for." As the morning progressed, Marcus found himself drawn into the rhythm of the Morrison family's life. He helped Richard with paperwork while the twins worked on diagnosing other vehicles in the shop. Despite their youth and the subtle tremors that occasionally affected their movements, Jake and Sam demonstrated remarkable skill and ingenuity in their approach to mechanical problems. "They're incredibly talented," Marcus observed to Richard, as they watched the boys collaborate on a particularly challenging transmission repair. "Always have been," Richard replied with obvious pride. Even before the diagnosis, they had an intuitive understanding of how things work. The Huntingtons has forced them to develop even more creative solutions, different techniques that work, around their limitations. Marcus watched Jake use a specially modified wrench that accommodated his tremor, while Sam employed a steadying technique that involved bracing his arm against the workbench. Their movements were deliberate and careful, but no less effective than those of mechanics with steady hands. "Do you ever worry about their future?" Marcus asked quietly. Richard's expression grew more serious. "Every parent worries about their children's future, but these boys have shown me that having Huntington's doesn't mean giving up on life. It just means approaching it differently. They've already accomplished more than most people their age, and they're just getting started." Around midday, a steady stream of customers began arriving at the shop, and Marcus was struck by the way the community embraced the Morrison family. Elderly farmers brought their ancient pickup trucks for repairs, young mothers dropped off, family sedans, and even the local sheriff stopped by to have his patrol car serviced. In each interaction, Marcus noticed how naturally people accommodated Jake and Sam's occasional tremors, how conversations continued seamlessly even when one of the boys needed to pause or steady himself. This is what acceptance looks like, Marcus realized, watching Sam explain a repair procedure to a customer while his hands shook slightly. The customer listened attentively, asked thoughtful questions, and showed no sign of discomfort or pity. It was simply part of the normal fabric of life in Cedar Falls. That afternoon, while the twins worked on his Bentley, Marcus took a walk through downtown Cedar Falls. The storm had left everything sparkling clean, and he found himself enchanted by the town's simple charm. There was the inevitable coffee shop with local art on the walls, a small bookstore that seemed to specialize in regional history and outdoor guides, and a diner that advertised world-famous pie, though Marcus suspected the fame might be limited to a fairly small geographic area. At the bookstore, Marcus discovered a medical textbook on neurological disorders that included an extensive section on Huntington's disease. As he flipped through the pages, reading about genetic testing, treatment options, and progression timelines, he felt the familiar knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. But this time, instead of slamming the book closed and walking away, he continued reading. The section on juvenile Huntington's disease was particularly sobering. Unlike the adult-onset form that had affected his mother, the juvenile variant typically began showing symptoms in childhood or adolescence and progressed more rapidly. The fact that Jake and Sam were not only coping with their diagnosis, but thriving despite it, seemed even more remarkable. "Doing some research?" a voice behind him asked. Marcus turned to find Jake approaching, having apparently finished working on the Bentley for the day. "I realized I don't know as much about the disease as I should," Marcus admitted. Jake nodded, understanding immediately. "It helps to know what you're dealing with, even if the information is scary." "How long have you and Sam been showing symptoms?" "Started noticing the tremors when we were about 13, Jake replied, settling into a chair beside Marcus. "At first, we thought it was just nerves or growing pains. But when Mum had passed from the same disease just a year earlier, Dad knew what to look for." Marcus closed the book, suddenly feeling overwhelmed by the clinical descriptions of a disease that had already taken so much from the people he was growing to care about. "I don't know how you stay so positive about it." Jake considered this for a moment. "I think it's because we've never known anything different. This is just part of who we are. Sam and I figure we can either spend our time being angry about something we can't change, or we can focus on making the most of whatever time we have. Your father said you both plan to take over the auto shop. Aren't you worried about how the disease will affect your ability to work? Of course we worry, Jake said honestly, but we're also constantly adapting and finding new ways to do things. Dad's been working with us to modify tools, develop techniques that work around our limitations. By the time the symptoms get more serious, we'll hopefully have trained other mechanics who can help carry the load. Marcus was struck by the long-term thinking involved in their planning. Rather than simply accepting defeat, the Morrison family was actively preparing for an uncertain future while continuing to live fully in the present. "Can I ask you something personal?" Jake said, his green eyes serious. "After everything you've shared with me, I think you've earned the right. Why haven't you gotten tested? What are you afraid of finding out?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the bookstore windows. "I guess I'm afraid that if I test positive, it will change everything. How I see myself, how other people see me, what my life means." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that fear, but here's what I've learned. The disease doesn't define you. How you respond to it does. Sam and I could have let the diagnosis destroy our dreams, but instead we used it to clarify what really matters to us. And what matters to you? Family, community, doing work that makes a difference in people's lives, helping Dad keep the shop running so that families like ours have a place to turn when they need help, building something that will last beyond whatever time we have." As Marcus walked back to Morrison's auto repair, Jake's words echoed in his mind. He'd spent his entire adult life accumulating wealth and power, but he'd never stopped to consider what would happen to that empire when he was gone. His company would undoubtedly continue without him, but would it make a real difference in anyone's life? Would anyone remember Marcus Chen, the person, or just Marcus Chen, the businessman? That evening, the Morrison family invited Marcus to join them for dinner at the local diner, apparently a Friday night tradition in Cedar Falls. The restaurant was packed with local families, and Marcus found himself introduced to what seemed like half the town's population. Without exception, people welcomed him warmly, though he could see the curious glances at his expensive clothes and obvious city origins. "Marcus is staying while we fix his car," Richard explained to various neighbors and friends. "Alternator went out in last night's storm." "Well, you picked a good place to break down," said an elderly woman named Dorothy, who seemed to know everyone's business and wasn't shy about sharing her opinions. "These Morrison boys can fix anything with wheels, and Richard makes the best. Coffee in 3 counties." As the evening progressed, Marcus watched the easy camaraderie between families who had clearly supported each other through good times and bad. When Jake's tremor caused him to spill his water glass, the waitress simply brought a towel and a refill without making a fuss. When Sam needed a moment to steady himself before standing up, the conversation continued naturally around him until he was ready to join in again. "This is what my mother always talked about," Marcus found himself telling Richard as they walked back to the auto shop under a canopy of brilliant stars. She grew up in a small town in Taiwan where everyone looked out for each other. She used to say that success meant nothing if you didn't have a community to share it with. "Sounds like a wise woman," Richard replied. "What would she think about Jake and Sam?" Marcus smiled, remembering his mother's fierce determination in the face of her own diagnosis. She would have loved them. She always said that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving forward despite it. Back in the spare room that night, Marcus lay awake thinking about the past 2 days. He'd come to Cedar Falls as a stranded stranger, but somehow these people had welcomed him as family. More importantly, they'd shown him a different way of approaching the fear that had been consuming him for months. His phone buzzed with another message from his assistant, this one marked urgent. A major acquisition deal was falling apart. Without his personal attention, and the board of directors was demanding explanations for his absence. 6 months ago, such messages would have sent him into a panic, driving him to catch the first flight back to civilization. Now, looking out at the peaceful mountain town bathed in moonlight, Marcus realized that for the first time in years, he felt exactly where he belonged. The business deal would either wait or it wouldn't. But this moment, this connection with people who understood what truly mattered, was irreplaceable. He picked up his phone and typed a message to his assistant. Handle the Peterson acquisition as you see fit. I'll be unavailable for the next few days. There's something more important I need to take care of here. For the first time since his mother's death, Marcus Chen fell asleep without the weight of corporate anxiety crushing his chest. Instead, he dreamed of mountain mornings and the sound of honest work being done by people who had figured out how to live with grace in the face of uncertainty. The answer to his fear wouldn't be found in avoiding genetic testing or burying himself in business deals. It would be found in learning from Jake and Sam Morrison how to face the future with courage, how to build something meaningful regardless of how much time he had to build it, and how to find family in the most unexpected places. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Marcus Chen was exactly where he needed to be. Marcus woke to the distant sound of metal against metal, the rhythmic clanging of tools in the garage below, serving as an unusual but oddly comforting alarm clock. Sunlight streamed through the simple curtains of the spare room, and for a moment he forgot where he was. Then the memories of the past 2 days came flooding back, along with a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in months. The smell of fresh coffee and bacon drew him downstairs, where he found Richard already dressed and preparing breakfast with the efficiency of someone accustomed to early mornings. Through the kitchen window, Marcus could see Jake and Sam in the garage, already at work despite the early hour, their movements careful but confident as they maneuvered around his Bentley. "They start early," Richard observed, following Marcus's gaze. "Always have, even as kids. Sarah used to joke that they were born with internal alarm clocks set to sunrise." Marcus accepted a steaming mug of coffee, noting how Richard's face softened whenever he mentioned his late wife. "Tell me about her," he said gently. Richard settled into the chair across from him, his own coffee cradling between weathered hands. Sarah was a nurse at the regional medical center, specialized in pediatric care. When we got the boy's diagnosis, she threw herself into researching everything she could about Huntington's disease. Became something of an expert, actually. He paused, lost in memory. "She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I wouldn't let the boys use their condition as an excuse to limit their dreams." She sounds remarkable. She was. The boys get their strength from her, their refusal to accept limitations. Even when her own symptoms got worse, she kept working, kept planning for their future. She set up college funds, researched adaptive technologies, made connections with other families dealing with the same challenges. Marcus found himself thinking of his own mother's fierce determination, her insistence on maintaining her research even as the disease slowly stole her abilities. "My mother was similar. She kept working on her neurological research until the very end, said that understanding the disease was the only way to beat it." "What kind of research?" "Experimental treatments mostly. She was convinced that early intervention could slow the progression, maybe even prevent symptoms from manifesting in carriers who hadn't developed them yet." Marcus set down his coffee, a thought beginning to form. "She left behind years of notes, lab results, theoretical frameworks. I've been avoiding going through them, Richard studied him carefully. Because you're afraid of what you might find. Because I'm afraid of what I might not find, Marcus admitted. What if all her work led nowhere? What if there really is no hope? Before Richard could respond, Jake appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands on a shop rag. His tremor was more pronounced this morning, Marcus noticed, but his expression was bright with the satisfaction of problem solving. Good news and bad news about your car, Jake announced, settling into a chair. Good news is the alternator replacement is straightforward once the part arrives. Bad news is Denver's having supply chain issues, so it might be Monday before we can get what we need. Marcus felt a surprised surge of relief rather than frustration. That's fine. I was thinking I might extend my stay anyway, if you'll have me. Sam joined them, carrying a tablet covered in automotive diagrams. Extended stay might be good for you, he said with a grin. This place has a way of slowing people down, helping them figure out what really matters. Speaking of which, Richard interjected, there's something happening in town today that you might find interesting. The regional medical center is hosting a community health fair, and they always have specialists come in to talk about various conditions. This year, they're focusing on genetic disorders. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. I'm not sure I'm ready for that. No pressure, Jake said quickly. But Dr. Martinez, the neurologist who's been treating us, will be there. She's incredible, really understands how to talk to families about genetic conditions without scaring them to death. Plus, Sam added, the health fair has the best funnel cakes in Colorado. Dorothy from the diner runs the food booth, and she takes it as a personal insult if visitors don't try everything. Marcus found himself smiling despite his anxiety. Funnel cakes might be worth facing my fears. The Cedar Falls Community Health Fair was held in the town's modest civic center, a converted warehouse that had been decorated with colorful banners and filled with informational booths. Despite the small population, the event had drawn families from across the region, creating a festive atmosphere that felt more like a county fair than a medical conference. Marcus walked through the exhibits with the Morrison family, marveling at the range of services and information available. There were booths for diabetes management, heart health, mental wellness, and specialized support groups for various conditions. What struck him most was the lack of clinical sterility that he associated with medical environments. This felt warm, welcoming, focused on empowering people rather than overwhelming them with statistics and worst-case scenarios. Marcus, I'd like you to meet Dr. Sophia Martinez, Richard said, leading him to a booth decorated with brain anatomy charts and genetic counseling brochures. The woman behind the table was younger than Marcus had expected, with kind eyes and an easy smile that immediately put him at ease. Dr. Martinez has been working with Jake and Sam for 3 years, Richard explained. She's also the regional specialist for Huntington's disease. Dr. Martinez stood to shake Marcus's hand, her grip firm and reassuring. Richard tells me you lost your mother to Huntington's recently. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you, Marcus replied, surprised by how natural it felt to talk about his mother's illness here. She was Dr. Lily Chen, if you know her work in neurological research. Dr. Martinez's eyes widened with recognition. Of course I know her work. Dr. Chen's research on early intervention protocols has influenced treatment approaches across the country. She was brilliant. Marcus felt an unexpected surge of pride. She was, though I'm embarrassed to admit I've avoided reading most of her research. Too close to home, I suppose. That's completely understandable, Dr. Martinez said gently. But if you're ever ready to explore her work, I'd love to discuss it with you. Some of her theories about genetic expression and environmental factors are groundbreaking. Before Marcus could respond, Jake and Sam appeared at the booth, both carrying paper plates loaded with funnel cake and various fair foods. "Dr. Martinez, you have to try Dorothy's apple fritters," Sam said, offering a piece to the neurologist. "She says they're medicinal, though I think that's just her excuse to add extra sugar." "How are you boys feeling today?" Dr. Martinez asked, accepting the fritter with obvious familiarity and affection. "Good days," Jake replied, demonstrating by holding his hands steady for several seconds. "Working with our hands seems to help with the tremors sometimes." "That's consistent with what we know about motor control and focused activity," Dr. Martinez explained to Marcus. "Purposeful, practiced movements often show less tremor than random motion. It's one reason why occupational therapy can be so beneficial." Marcus watched the easy interaction between the doctor and the twins, noting how she treated them as whole people rather than collections of symptoms. "How long have they been showing symptoms?" "About 4 years now," Dr. Martinez replied. "But as you can see, they're thriving despite the challenges. Their case has actually contributed to my research on juvenile Huntington's management." "Research?" Marcus's interest was piqued despite his reservations. "I'm studying how early intervention, community support, and adaptive strategies can impact quality of life and potentially slow progression," Dr. Martinez explained. "Jake and Sam have been incredible participants, helping me understand what works and what doesn't from a patient perspective." Sam swallowed his bite of funnel cake before speaking. "The research is important because every family dealing with this deserves to know what options they have. We're lucky to be part of something that might help other people." Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the weight of his own untested status pressing down on him. Dr. Martinez seemed to sense his discomfort. "Would you like to walk around the fair a bit?" she suggested. "Sometimes it helps to see the bigger picture before focusing on specific concerns." "Ooh." As they moved through the various booths, Marcus began to understand what Dr. Martinez meant. He met families dealing with diabetes who had learned to manage their condition so effectively that it barely impacted their daily lives. He spoke with a teenager who had been born with a congenital heart defect but was now training for regional swimming competitions. He encountered elderly couples who had navigated cancer, autoimmune disorders, and degenerative conditions while maintaining active, fulfilling lives. "The human capacity for adaptation is remarkable," Dr. Martinez observed as they watched a demonstration of adaptive technologies for people with various mobility challenges. "We often focus so much on what diseases take away that we forget to celebrate what people create in response." They paused at a booth run by a genetic counseling service where families were learning about various inherited conditions and testing options. Marcus found himself listening to a presentation about the psychological aspects of genetic testing, the factors people should consider when deciding whether to pursue genetic information. "The decision to get tested is deeply personal," the genetic counselor was explaining to a small group. "Some people find that knowing their status, positive or negative, helps them make informed decisions about their lives. Others prefer not to know, and that's equally valid. There's no right or wrong choice, only the choice that's right for you." Marcus felt Dr. Martinez's gentle attention as he absorbed this information. "I've been avoiding genetic testing for months," he admitted quietly. "What's holding you back?" she asked without judgment. "Fear, mostly. Fear of confirmation. Fear of having to change everything about how I see my future." He paused, watching Jake and Sam examine a display of adaptive tools with genuine curiosity rather than resignation. But watching these boys, seeing how they've built a life around their condition rather than despite it, maybe I'm approaching this all wrong. "How so?" "I've been thinking that testing positive would be the end of something, but maybe it could be the beginning of something else, a chance to make different choices, focus on what really matters. Dr. Martinez smiled. That's a profound shift in perspective. Your mother's research actually supported that approach. The idea that early awareness can lead to proactive strategies that significantly impact outcomes. As the afternoon progressed, Marcus found himself drawn deeper into conversations with families, medical professionals, and community members. He learned about support groups, clinical trials, lifestyle modifications that could potentially influence genetic expression, and most importantly, the power of community in facing medical challenges. When the fair began winding down, Richard suggested they all head to the diner for dinner, a suggestion that seemed to please everyone involved. Dr. Martinez joined them, clearly as much a friend of the Morrison family as their physician. Over plates of Dorothy's famous meatloaf and mashed potatoes, the conversation turned to Marcus's background and what had brought him to Cedar Falls. He found himself sharing more about his technology company, his mother's research, and his struggle with the possibility of carrying the Huntington's gene. You know, Dr. Martinez said thoughtfully, your mother's research and my current studies might actually complement each other quite well. She focused on the cellular level, while I'm looking at comprehensive care models. Together, they could provide a more complete picture of how to approach Huntington's disease. What do you mean? Marcus asked. Well, your mother's work on neuroprotective strategies could inform my research on early intervention, while my data on quality of life factors could support her theories about environmental influences on genetic expression. It's exactly the kind of interdisciplinary approach that could lead to real breakthroughs. Jake leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest. Could that research help other families like ours? Potentially, yes, Dr. Martinez replied, but it would require someone with the resources and connections to bridge the gap between laboratory research and clinical application. Marcus felt something click into place, a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since his mother's death. What would that look like, practically speaking? Research funding, clinical trial support, technology development for adaptive tools, community outreach programs, Dr. Martinez explained. The kind of comprehensive approach that requires both scientific expertise and significant financial backing. Sam had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up. You could do that, couldn't you? With your technology background and resources? Marcus considered this, feeling a spark of excitement that had nothing to do with quarterly profits or market dominance. I could, but I'd want to do it right. Really understand what families need, rather than just throwing money at problems. That's where community partnerships come in, Richard added. Places like Cedar Falls, families like ours, we could help you understand the real-world impact of different approaches. As they walked back to the auto shop that evening, Marcus felt a fundamental shift in his thinking. The question was no longer whether he would get genetic testing, but when and how he would use that information to make a difference. His mother's research suddenly felt like a legacy to be built upon, rather than a painful reminder to be avoided. Dr. Martinez, he said as they reached the garage, I'd like to schedule genetic testing with you. And I'd like to discuss how we might collaborate on research that could actually help families dealing with Huntington's disease. The neurologist smiled warmly. I think your mother would be proud of that decision. That night, as Marcus prepared for bed in the Morrisons' spare room, he realized that his perspective on the future had completely transformed in just 3 days. Instead of seeing genetic testing as a potential death sentence, he now viewed it as information that could guide meaningful action. Whether he carried the gene or not, he had found a purpose that went beyond personal success. He pulled out his laptop and began drafting an email to his assistant, outlining his intention to establish a research foundation focused on Huntington's disease. The Chen Foundation, he decided, would honor his mother's memory by funding exactly the kind of interdisciplinary research that Dr. Martinez had described. But more than that, it would be based in Cedar Falls, Colorado, where he had learned that true wealth wasn't measured in stock portfolios or real estate holdings, but in the strength of community bonds and the courage to face uncertainty with grace. The next morning brought Marcus's first experience with the Morrison family's Sunday routine. Richard prepared a substantial breakfast while Jake and Sam organized their work schedule for the coming week, their movements careful but efficient, despite the early morning stiffness that seemed to accompany their condition. "Sleep well?" Richard asked, noting Marcus's unusually relaxed demeanor. "Better than I have in months," Marcus replied honestly. "I've been doing some thinking about what we discussed yesterday." He pulled out his laptop and showed them the draft proposal he'd been working on since dawn. The Chen Foundation would focus on three main areas: funding research into early intervention strategies for Huntington's disease, developing community-based support programs, and creating adaptive technologies that could help people maintain independence longer. The foundation would partner with places like Cedar Falls, Marcus explained, learning from families who are actually living with these challenges rather than just studying them in laboratories. Jake and Sam read through the proposal with growing excitement, occasionally exchanging glances as they recognized elements that directly addressed their own experiences. "This section about adaptive tools," Sam said, pointing to a paragraph. "On the screen, this could help so many families. We've had to modify most of our equipment ourselves because nothing commercial really works the way we need it to." "That's exactly the kind of real-world insight the foundation would need," Marcus replied. "Would you be interested in consulting on tool development? Your practical experience could inform designs that actually work for people." The twins looked to their father, who nodded encouragingly. "We'd love to help," Jake said. "Anything we can do to make things easier for other families." As they discussed the foundation's possibilities, Marcus felt a sense of excitement and purpose that had been missing from his business ventures for years. This wasn't about profit margins or market share, but about creating something that could genuinely improve lives. "There's something else I want to discuss," Marcus said, his tone growing more serious. "I've decided to go through with genetic testing, and I'd like to do it here in Cedar Falls with Dr. Martinez." Richard set down his coffee, understanding the significance of this decision. "That's a big step. How are you feeling about it?" "Scared, but determined," Marcus admitted. "I realized that whether I test positive or negative, I want to be part of the solution. If I carry the gene, then I'll face it with the same courage you've all shown me. If I don't, then I'll work even harder to help families who do." "Either way," Jake said thoughtfully, "you'll know where you stand, and you can make decisions based on facts instead of fear." "Exactly," Marcus agreed. "My mother spent years researching this disease while living with it. The least I can do is find out if I inherited her condition along with her passion for fighting it." Later that morning, they drove to the regional medical center where Dr. Martinez had agreed to meet them on her day off. The facility was smaller than the research hospitals Marcus was accustomed to, but it felt more personal, more focused on patient care than institutional prestige. Dr. Martinez walked them through the testing process, explaining exactly what the genetic analysis would reveal and how long results would take. She also spent considerable time discussing the psychological aspects of testing, making sure Marcus understood the potential emotional impacts of both positive and negative results. "The test itself is simple," she explained. "Preparing a blood sample kit. The waiting is the hard part. Results usually take about 2 weeks." 2 weeks, Marcus repeated, feeling a familiar knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. "You don't have to wait alone," Sam said quietly. We've been through this process. We know what it's like. The uncertainty is the worst part, Jake added. Once you know, you can start making plans. Before you know, everything feels suspended. As Dr. Martinez drew his blood, Marcus focused on the voices of his new friends, drawing strength from their presence. These young men had faced the same fear he was experiencing now, and they had emerged stronger and more purposeful because of it. What happens next? Marcus asked as Dr. Martinez labeled his sample. Now you go live your life for 2 weeks, she replied with a smile. Don't put anything on hold waiting for results. In fact, I'd recommend using this time to move forward with your foundation plans. Whether the test is positive or negative, that work will be meaningful. As they left the medical center, Marcus felt a strange sense of lightness despite the gravity of what he'd just done. For months, he'd been paralyzed by the possibility of testing positive for Huntington's disease. Now that he'd actually taken the step, he discovered that action was far less frightening than endless speculation. Congratulations, Richard said as they drove back toward town. For what? For choosing courage over comfort, Richard replied. That's never easy, but it's always worth it. The remainder of Sunday was spent in quiet activity around the Morrison home. Marcus helped Jake and Sam organize their tool collection, learning about the various modifications they'd made to accommodate their tremors. He was impressed by their ingenuity and attention to detail, recognizing the same problem-solving abilities that had made him successful in technology. Have you ever considered starting your own tool modification business? Marcus asked as he watched Sam demonstrate a specially designed wrench that provided better grip stability. We've talked about it, Sam replied, but the market seems pretty limited. I'm not so sure about that, Marcus said thoughtfully. There are thousands of people dealing with similar coordination challenges, not just from Huntington's, but from Parkinson's, arthritis, stroke recovery, all kinds of conditions. The right adaptive tools could make a huge difference in their quality of life. Jake looked up from the wrench he was adjusting. You think there's really a market for this kind of thing? I think there's a need, which is even better than a market, Marcus replied. A need has a way of creating its own market when the right people get involved. As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself sketching out business plans for adaptive tool development, ideas for research partnerships, and frameworks for community outreach programs. For the first time in his professional life, he was designing a venture based on purpose rather than profit potential. That evening, as they sat on the Morrison's small front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Marcus reflected on how completely his priorities had shifted in just 4 days. I need to ask you something, he said to Richard, Jake, and Sam. I know I've only been here a short time, but this place, this community, you three, you've changed my perspective on everything. I'd like to base the foundation here in Cedar Falls, make this its home rather than just a distant funding source. What would that mean practically? Richard asked. It would mean relocating my primary residence here, setting up foundation, offices in town, becoming part of the community rather than just a visitor. Marcus paused, looking at each of them. It would mean asking if you'd consider working with me long-term, helping build something that could really make a difference. The twins exchanged one of their silent communications before Jake spoke for both of them. We'd be honored to work with you, but are you sure you want to leave your life in the city for a town this small? Marcus smiled, thinking of his empty penthouse and corporate boardrooms filled with people who knew his net worth, but nothing about his character. I don't think I'd be leaving my life behind. I think I'd finally be starting it. As the stars began to appear in the clear mountain sky, Marcus felt a peace he'd never experienced in his pursuit of business success. Whether his genetic test, came back positive or negative, he knew he'd found his purpose in this small Colorado town with these remarkable people who had shown him what real courage looked like. The next morning brought news that Marcus's Bentley was finally ready, the new alternator installed and tested. Instead of relief at the prospect of leaving, Marcus felt a pang of loss at the thought of driving away from Cedar Falls. The car's running perfectly, Jake announced as they gathered in the garage. Purrs like it's brand new. Thank you, Marcus said, though his gratitude encompassed far more than automotive repair. All of you. You've given me something I didn't even know I was looking for. What's that? Sam asked. Hope, Marcus replied simply, and purpose, and the best example of courage I've ever seen. Richard clapped him on the shoulder. You're welcome back anytime. This will always be your second home. Actually, Marcus said, pulling out his phone, I was hoping it might become my first home. I just got confirmation that the old Victorian house on Maple Street is for sale. I'd like to make an offer. The surprise on their faces was exactly what Marcus had hoped to see. After a moment of stunned silence, Hannah broke into a grin that was quickly mirrored by his brother. You're really staying? Jake asked. I'm really staying, Marcus confirmed. I have a foundation to build, research to fund, and apparently a tool modification business to help get off the ground. Plus, someone needs to make sure you two don't work yourselves to death in this garage. As he drove his newly repaired Bentley through the streets of Cedar Falls, Marcus marveled at how different the town looked now compared to his first storm-soaked glimpse. This wasn't just a place he'd been stranded, it was home. These weren't just people who had helped him, they were family. 2 weeks later, as he sat in Dr. Martinez's office waiting for his genetic test results, Marcus felt calm in a way that would have been impossible a month earlier. Whatever the results showed, he knew exactly what he would do with the information. Dr. Martinez opened the folder containing his results, her expression professionally neutral. Marcus, your genetic test shows that you do carry the gene mutation associated with Huntington's disease. The words hung in the air for a moment, carrying all the weight of uncertainty and fear that had haunted Marcus for months. But instead of the crushing despair he'd expected, he felt an odd sense of relief. Thank you for being so thorough, he said finally. When can we start developing a comprehensive management plan? Dr. Martinez smiled, recognizing the transformation. In her patient, we can start immediately, and with the foundation resources you're developing, we'll have access to cutting-edge approaches that most patients never get to try. As Marcus left the medical center, he thought about Jake and Sam Morrison, who had faced the same diagnosis with grace and determination. He thought about his mother, who had spent her final years fighting the disease that would eventually claim her. And he thought about all the families who would benefit from the research and support programs he was now positioned to fund. The genetic test had given him an answer, but more importantly, it had given him a mission. Marcus Chen might develop Huntington's disease someday, but he would face it as part of a community that understood the value of courage, the power of purpose, and the importance of building something meaningful with whatever time he had. Cedar Falls had taught him that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the connections between people who chose to face life's challenges together. And that was a kind of richness that no disease could ever take away. 6 months had passed since Marcus received his genetic test results, and Cedar Falls had become more than just his new home. It had become the center of a revolution in Huntington's disease research and support. The Chen Foundation had established its headquarters in a renovated building on Main Street, and what had started as one man's personal journey had grown into a beacon of hope for families across the country. Marcus stood in the Foundation's main conference room, looking out at the mountains that had witnessed his transformation from isolated billionaire to community advocate. Today marked a special milestone, the grand opening of the Morrison Adaptive Technology Center, a joint venture between the Foundation and Jake and Sam's innovative tool modification business. The twins had thrown themselves into the project with characteristic determination, designing adaptive equipment that was now being used by physical therapy centers nationwide. Their personal experience with Huntington's disease had given them insights that no engineering degree could provide, and their creations were helping people maintain independence far longer than traditional tools allowed. "Marcus, they're ready for you," Dr. Martinez called from the doorway. She had become the Foundation's chief medical advisor, splitting her time between patient care and research coordination that was beginning to show promising results. The ceremony was being held in the town's civic center, the same building where Marcus had first learned about genetic testing at the health fair. Now the space was filled with families affected by Huntington's disease, medical professionals from around the region, and curious townspeople who had watched their community become an unlikely center of medical innovation. As Marcus took the podium, he looked out at faces that had become familiar over the past months. There was Dorothy from the diner, who had become the unofficial coordinator for visiting families, ensuring everyone was fed and welcomed. There was Richard Morrison, beaming with pride at his son's achievements. And there were Jake and Sam themselves, sitting in the front row with expressions of nervous excitement. "6 months ago, I was a stranger who got lost in a storm," Marcus began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "I thought I was looking for a way back to the highway, but I found something much more valuable. I found a community that taught me the difference between success and significance." He gestured toward the twins. "Jake and Sam Morrison didn't just help me fix my car that night. They helped me fix my perspective on what it means to live with purpose, especially when facing uncertain health outcomes." The audience murmured appreciatively, many of them families who had traveled to Cedar Falls, specifically to learn from the Morrison approach to living with Huntington's disease. The Morrison Adaptive Technology Center represents more than just clever engineering, Marcus continued. It represents the power of turning personal challenges into solutions that benefit others. Every tool designed here comes from real experience, real need, real understanding of what families face every day. As he spoke about the Foundation's achievements, Marcus thought about his own health journey. Regular monitoring with Dr. Martinez had shown that while he carried the gene, he hadn't yet developed symptoms. The uncertainty remained, but it no longer paralyzed him. Instead, it motivated him to make every day count. After the ceremony, as people mingled and examined the new adaptive tools on display, Marcus found himself in conversation with a young couple who had driven from Kansas specifically to learn about the Morrison approach. "Our son was just diagnosed with juvenile Huntington's," the woman explained, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "He's only 15, and we don't know how to help him plan for the future." "You've come to the right place," Marcus assured her. "Jake and Sam were diagnosed at 14, and look what they've accomplished. Would you like to meet them?" As he introduced the family to the twins, Marcus marveled at how naturally Jake and Sam had become mentors to other young people facing similar diagnoses. They spoke with authority, born from experience, offering practical advice about managing symptoms, pursuing goals, and maintaining hope. "The key is not to plan around the disease," Sam was explaining to the teenager. "Plan around your interests and abilities, then adapt as needed. We wanted to work with our hands, so we figured out how to modify tools when our hands don't cooperate. Datu, it's about what you can do, not what you can't," Jake added. "Every day is different, but every day has possibilities if you're willing to look for them." Later that evening, the Morrison family and Marcus gathered at the diner for their traditional celebration dinner. The relationship between them had evolved far beyond the gratitude of a stranded motorist. They had become true family, bound not by blood, but by shared purpose and mutual respect. "I have something I want to share with all of you," Marcus said, as they finished Dorothy's latest creation, a chocolate pie that defied several laws of physics in its richness. Dr. Martinez got some preliminary results from the clinical trial we've been funding. The table went quiet. The foundation had been supporting a revolutionary study combining Marcus's mother's neuroprotective research with Dr. Martinez's community-based care model. Early results had been promising, but they were all waiting for more definitive data. "The combination approach is showing significant benefits," Marcus continued, unable to suppress his excitement. Participants who received both the neuroprotective therapy and comprehensive community support showed slower progression rates than either intervention alone. Richard leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. "You mean the research is actually working?" "It means we're on the right track," Dr. Martinez clarified, joining them at the table. "We're still years away from calling it a cure, but we're definitely seeing evidence that early intervention can make a real difference." Jake and Sam exchanged glances, hope and caution warring in their expressions. They had learned not to expect miracles, but they couldn't help feeling excited about the possibility of slowing their disease's progression. "What does this mean for current patients?" Sam asked practically. "It means we expand the trial," Dr. Martinez replied. "We're getting approval to include more participants, test the protocols at multiple sites, and refine the treatment approach based on what we've learned." As they discussed the research implications, Marcus felt a profound sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with financial returns or business achievements. This was what his mother had dreamed of when she dedicated her life to Huntington's research, the kind of breakthrough that could transform thousands of lives. "There's something else," Marcus said, his tone growing more personal. "I've been thinking about next steps for myself, for all of us really." He pulled out a folder containing architectural plans, spreading them across the table next to the pie plates. "These are designs for a residential research facility, a place where families dealing with Huntington's could come for treatment, support, and respite care." The plans showed a campus-style facility nestled into the mountainside above Cedar Falls, designed to feel more like a retreat center than a medical institution. There were family housing units, therapy centers, research laboratories, and recreational facilities all integrated into a setting that emphasized healing and hope. The facility would be staffed by people who understand the disease personally, Marcus explained, looking meaningfully at Jake and Sam. "Peer counselors, adaptive technology specialists, recreational therapists who know how to work with movement disorders." "You want us to be part of this?" Jake asked, studying the plans with growing interest. "I want you to help design it. Staff it. Make it the kind of place you would want to bring your own family someday," Marcus replied. "This would be your facility as much as mine." Richard wiped his eyes with his napkin, overwhelmed by the scope of what Marcus was proposing. "Sarah would have loved this," he said quietly. "A place where families don't have to face this disease alone." As they walked back to the Morrison home that night, Marcus reflected on how completely his life had changed since that stormy night when his car broke down. He had gained not just a new perspective on his health challenges, but a new family and a new purpose that gave meaning to every day. The Victorian house he'd purchased on Maple Street had become a gathering place for visiting families, researchers, and anyone connected to the Foundation's work. It was rarely empty, always filled with the kind of meaningful activity that his previous life had completely lacked. "Marcus," Sam said, as they reached the Morrisons' front porch, "can I ask you something personal?" Of course. Do you ever regret getting tested, knowing what you know now? Marcus considered the question carefully. His genetic status meant he would likely develop Huntington's disease at some point, probably within the next 10 to 15 years. But that knowledge had also freed him to make choices based on purpose rather than fear. No, he said definitively. Knowing has allowed me to be intentional about how I spend my time, who I spend it with, what legacy I want to leave. I can't control whether I develop symptoms, but I can control what I do with the healthy years I have. That's what we figured, Jake said with a smile. Just wanted to make sure we were thinking about it right. 3 months later, groundbreaking for the Cedar Falls, Huntington's Research and Family Center, began with a ceremony that drew families from across the country. The facility represented the largest private investment in Huntington's disease research and support in the nation's history, but more importantly, it represented hope made tangible. Marcus stood with Jake and Sam as they turned the first shovels of earth, marveling at how these two young men had become the heart of everything he was building. Their courage in facing an uncertain future had inspired not just him, but countless other families who saw in them proof that Huntington's disease didn't have to mean the end of dreams. As construction progressed over the following months, Marcus began experiencing his first subtle symptoms. A slight tremor in his left hand that appeared when he was tired, occasional difficulty with complex motor tasks, minor coordination issues that most people wouldn't notice, but that he recognized from watching his mother's early progression. Dr. Martinez confirmed what Marcus already suspected during a routine monitoring appointment. "You're showing early motor signs," she said gently. "Very mild, and progression patterns vary widely, but we should start thinking about treatment options." Instead of the crushing despair he had once feared, Marcus felt an odd sense of relief. The waiting was over, the uncertainty resolved. Now he could focus on managing his condition while continuing the work that had become his life's mission. "I want to participate in our own clinical trial," he told Dr. Martinez. "If the treatments we're developing work, I want to be part of proving it." The decision to publicly share his diagnosis was not made lightly. Marcus consulted with his foundation team, the Morrison family, and most importantly with other families who might be affected by his disclosure. "People look up to you," Jake pointed out during one of their planning sessions. "If you show them that it's possible to live well with this disease, it could help a lot of families stop being afraid." "But it also means giving up privacy," Sam added. "Once people know, everything you do becomes public." Marcus understood the implications, but he also understood the opportunity. As one of the world's most recognizable business leaders, his openness about Huntington's disease could bring unprecedented attention to research and support needs. The announcement was made at the opening ceremony for the Cedar Falls Research Center, exactly 1 year after Marcus's car had broken down in the storm. Standing before an audience that included national media, medical professionals, and dozens of affected families, Marcus spoke with the calm certainty that had become his trademark. 12 months ago, I was a successful businessman who was terrified of his genetic destiny," he began. "Today, I'm a Huntington's disease patient who has never felt more purposeful or more hopeful about the future." He gestured toward the gleaming new facility behind him, its design incorporating natural materials and large windows that showcase the surrounding mountain views. "This center exists because I learned that facing our fears with courage and community support can transform even the most challenging circumstances into opportunities for meaningful impact." The facility's opening marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Huntington's research, but for how society approached genetic diseases in general. Families who had hidden their diagnoses out of shame or fear began speaking openly about their experiences. Researchers who had struggled with funding found new support for innovative approaches. Young people facing genetic testing decisions had new models of how to live with uncertain health futures. Jake and Sam became the center's first peer counselors, working with newly diagnosed individuals and families who were learning to navigate life with Huntington's disease. Their combination of technical expertise and personal experience made them uniquely qualified to help others find hope and practical strategies for adaptation. We tell people that having Huntington's is like being dealt a challenging hand in a card game, Jake explained to a new support group. You can't change the cards you're holding, but you can still play them strategically and find ways to win. The key is defining what winning means to you, Sam added. For us, winning means continuing to work, continuing to contribute, continuing to build relationships and experiences that matter. Marcus, now showing more obvious symptoms but still fully functional, had become an advocate for early intervention and proactive planning. His public battle with the disease brought attention and resources to Huntington's research that had been unimaginable just 2 years earlier. The Foundation's work had expanded beyond Huntington's disease to include other genetic conditions, always following the Cedar Falls model of combining cutting-edge research with community-based support and peer mentorship. The small Colorado town had become a destination for families seeking hope and practical help with inherited diseases. On the second anniversary of his arrival in Cedar Falls, Marcus sat on his front porch with Richard, Jake, and Sam, watching the sunset paint the mountains in familiar shades of gold and crimson. His tremor was more pronounced now, and he occasionally struggled with speech clarity, but his mind remained sharp and his determination stronger than ever. Do you ever wonder, what would have happened if your car hadn't broken down that night? Richard asked, a question that had become something of a family tradition. Marcus smiled, flexing his trembling hands as he considered the alternate timeline. I think I would have made it to Denver, closed whatever business deal I was chasing, and continued living a life that felt successful but was ultimately empty. Instead, you found your real purpose, Jake observed. No, Marcus corrected gently. You helped me find my real purpose. The disease was just information. What I did with that information, how I chose to respond to it, that came from watching how you and Sam face uncertainty with courage. As the stars began to appear in the clear mountain sky, Marcus reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. A broken-down car had led to a broken-down life being rebuilt into something meaningful. A genetic disease that he had feared would destroy his future had instead clarified what kind of future he wanted to build. The Chen Foundation would continue its work long after Marcus's symptoms progressed beyond his ability to lead it. Jake and Sam Morrison would carry forward the vision of turning personal challenges into community solutions. Dr. Martinez would publish research that could help thousands of families navigate genetic diseases with hope rather than despair. But more than any professional legacy, Marcus treasured the family he had found in Cedar Falls, the sense of belonging that had replaced his former isolation. He might develop Huntington's disease, but he would face it surrounded by people who understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to keep building something beautiful even when the future remained uncertain. The small town that had welcomed a stranded stranger had become home to a revolution in how society approached genetic diseases. And the twins who had stopped to help fix a broken car had become the heart of a movement that would help countless. Families discover that a diagnosis didn't have to mean the end of hope. As they said goodnight and headed inside, Marcus took one last look at the lights of Cedar Falls twinkling below his porch. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new symptoms to manage, new families to support. But tonight, Surrounded by the people who had taught him what real wealth looked like, Marcus Chen felt richer than he had ever imagined possible. The storm that had stranded him in this mountain town had been the best thing that ever happened to him, leading not to the life he had planned, but to the life he was meant to live. Sometimes getting lost was the only way to find what you were really looking for. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.